Welcome to In the Adirondack Library, the Adirondack Experiences virtual book series, featuring recently published books about the North Country. I'm Jenny Ambrose, the museum's Director of Archives and Special Collections. Thank you for joining us for the 5th program in the series, which explores Adirondack life, history, and culture through the work of a diverse group of regional authors. All of the books in the series will join thousands of other books about the Adirondacks lining our library shelves. I hope you will join us every month on Monday evenings throughout the winter and spring for conversations with our authors. Books in the series are available in the museum's online store and at your public library. A full schedule, as well as information about the books and authors, are available at our website, theadkx.org. We will post links to additional information about tonight's program in the series in the chat. The museum is delighted that Mitch Tyke, station manager of North Country Public Radio and host of Northwards, agreed to conduct the author interviews for the series. His weekly show, Northwards, features conversations with people from around the North Country about what makes living here special and unique. Enjoy Mitch's thoughtful, engaging interviews during the museum's monthly Monday night book programs and in episodes of his podcast every Friday afternoon. This evening, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sally Svenson, author of Adirondack Photographers, 1850 to 1950. Sally is an independent scholar and author who's taken an active interest in investigating underdocumented aspects of Adirondack history. Her articles about 19th century American figures, from wilderness missionaries to Civil War veterans, have appeared in various journals. She is the author of several books, including Adirondack Churches, A History of Design and Building, and Blacks in the Adirondacks, which received the Adirondack Literary Award for Best Book of Nonfiction. Tonight, Sally will provide a brief illustrated introduction to her new book, which explores the lives and careers of photographers who worked in the Adirondack Mountain region, focusing their lenses on the natural landscape and every aspect of life in the North Country. Then she'll answer questions from Mitch Tyke and members of the audience. We welcome your participation. Please submit your questions at any time in the program through the Q&A feature. And now I'll turn the virtual podium over to Sally. Welcome.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you for joining us, everybody who's out there. And thank you to the Adirondack Experience for inviting me to speak as part of this intriguing new series. Adirondack, I'm going to read most of my script, so you'll just have to forgive me as I go. Adirondack Photographers, 1850 to 1950, is briefly a straightforward dictionary of some 225 photographers who worked in the region at some point during these 100 years and had at least a small body of images attached to their names. Some of the entries are only a paragraph or two in length. A few of them run on for a couple of pages. The dictionary is preceded by a general introduction to the history of photography, as well as a brief discussion about the most common Adirondack photographic subjects. In its totality, that book, I think, provides an intriguing look at the great variety of skills and the personal trajectories of those who followed the art and craft of photography in the Adirondacks, usually as a commercial endeavor, during the years covered. There are not a lot of images in the book, only 73 to be exact, but I was extremely concerned about how the book would be priced and knew that keeping the number of images down would keep costs down. I am so pleased that Syracuse University Press was able to produce a handsome book at a reasonable price. This was in part due to the press's receipt of a grant from the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven to aid in the book's production, for which I would like to express my appreciation to the foundation. I thought it might be fun this evening to say a bit about how I came to write the book, how I determined the list of photographers to research, about people who helped me with the research, and about a few examples of things that I found particularly exciting as I was putting the book together. I've been writing about Adirondack history for more than 20 years, almost from the first days after my husband and I arrived in the Adirondacks as seasonal residents in the early 2000s. My first book, Adirondack Churches, A History of Design and Building, published in 2006 by Adirondack Architectural Heritage, included more than 200 illustrations from over 80 sources. Most of these illustrations were photographs, and while the names of the photographers who took the pictures, if known, were included in the captions, I didn't care much about who they were. A few years later, a bit of a puzzlement arose as to exactly where a photograph by a regional photographer might have been taken, and tracing his career history was more than useful in determining the photograph's location. It was then that I started thinking about the people behind the camera and about the possibility of finding out and writing something about the photographers who worked in the Adirondack region. The start date of 1850 was pretty easy to determine. After all, the invention of the daguerreotype, the first widely used photographic format, was only announced by Louis Daguerre, a French diorama painter, in 1839, and the first daguerreotype studio opened in New York City in 1840. While a few itinerant daguerreotypists visited the Adirondacks in the 1840s, it was not until 1850 that the general region could claim its first two photographers, Philemon Tenney Gates in Plattsburgh and Tarrant Putnam in Keysville. 1950 was as easily determined as a cutoff date because census data is one of the most useful ways to track individual histories. And as this is not released by the federal government until 72 years after a census is taken, the latest records available to me during the years I was working in the book were from 1940. It seemed, too, that perhaps it was not an awful idea to let a little dust settle on more recent photographic careers before entering them in a composite historical record. I began to create a list of photographers to research by simply running the keyword photographer through the two amazing historic newspaper sites available to Adirondack researchers, New York Historic Newspapers and Tom Krasinski's Old Fulton, New York postcards, commonly known as Fulton History. Sometimes, thanks to newspaper searching, I was able to discover exact dates when out-of-region photographers visited the Adirondacks. I found more names by rummaging around online in photographic databases, starting with that of the Adirondack Experience, which has a superb collection of early photographs. I also went through the online collections of the New York State Archives, as well as those of the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and a few others. Before long, I had the list I was looking for. I was hooked on the photography project from the moment I began my in-depth research. In the summer of 2016, when I was just getting started, Jerry Pepper, who was then the librarian at the Adirondack Experience, suggested that I look through a few copies of a journal published in the years around the turn of the 20th century by what was then called the New York State Forest Commission. As he explained, the journal used a number of high-quality photographs taken by regional photographers in illustrating it, so he thought I might find it useful. Indeed, I did, as I immediately discovered two unheralded photographers whose stories at least tripled the level of my commitment. The first of these was F.A. Van Sant, with the F standing in very quietly for the photographer's feminine given name, Florence. Florence Van Sant turned out to be one of only 11 women photographers I came upon in the entire course of my research. She lived in Jay, Essex County, and was the wife of a Methodist minister who had recently retired from the ministry after contracting tuberculosis. She captured some wonderful images when she was in her late 20s and early 30s during what was her brief 1896 to 1902 photographic career. First slide, please. This primarily documents scenery. Let's see, missed a little. Okay, her photographs primarily documented scenery and employee life in and around Jay, relating to the Adirondack activities of the Osable company named J&J Rogers. This magic lantern slide from the New York State Archives digital collection appears in my book and shows a Van Sant image from the top of what was a 7-mile-long log slide in Essex County, used in the moving logs cut in the upland forest downhill. I'm going, by the way, to mix this presentation up a bit by using a few photos that are not in the book. They can all be found online on the websites of the accredited institutions. Next slide, please. Coming up are 3 more Van Sant images from the New York State Archives digital collection, starting with a second image of logs moving along the log slide. I'm showing them here because I like Van Sant's work so much and because it is so little known. In fact, none of these photographs is attributed on the State Archives site, although I did send an email to the archives a couple of years ago listing views I recognized as Van Sant's. Hopefully, one day her name will be more familiar. Next slide, please. This photo ends the Rogers Company log slide story as the logs finish their trip down the slide and tumble into the Osable River on their way to a sawmill. Next slide, please. Van Sant also took a number of pictures of loggers as well as the landscapes associated with the Rogers Company. She obviously had a good rapport with the men who posed for her, and many men did. She provided images to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City for educational use, as well as to the New York State Conservation Department, and the New York City Museum as a small file of her correspondence. The second surprise name I came upon in paging through the Forest Commission reports was that of G.H. Rison, spelled R-I-S-O-N. Rison turned out to be a pseudonym for Grotus H. Rising, R-E-I-S-I-N-G, a German-born guide and carpenter from the one-time town of Wilmert, Herkimer County, which is now divided between the towns of Webb and Ohio. Rising was for a few years in the early 80s, when he was in his early 40s, the custodian of a private sporting and social club called the Morehouse Lake Club in Hoffmeister, Hamilton County. It must have been through a contact there that 4 of Rising's photographs, published under his Rison pseudonym, appeared in a fancy, large format 1894 book published in New York City and entitled Camera Mosaics. Next slide, please. This book of images was made up by camera club members from around the country and included a few big names like that of Adirondack-born William Henry Jackson, a famous recorder of the early West who later took a good number of Adirondack pictures. It also included work by the famous Canadian photographer William Notman. This before you is a self-portrait of Rison/Rising framed by a dead deer, and is one of the photographer's contributions to camera mosaics. I can't imagine quite why Rison felt that he needed a pseudonym in connection with this public work. Next slide, please. This very different photograph is held by the Adirondack Experience and is attributed to Rising under his own name. It is a cyanotype and was printed by a special process that gave it this blue-green or cyan color. The photo was taken from the summit of Panther Mountain, close to Pico Lake. Having been completely bowled over by these initial findings about Van Sant and Rising, I was highly motivated to keep going. But before I move on here, I'd like to mention Florence Van Sant one last time, this time in connection with the incredible help I got from others in locating information about my subjects, sometimes from family members. In looking for information on Van Sant, I came upon a tribute to Great Aunt Florence on an unlikely online site called Find a Grave. This shows photographs of graves around the country, and it had a picture of her grave in New York. The address of the person offering the tribute was included, and I got in touch. This lovely woman who lives in the Midwest was nice enough to send me an original portrait photograph of her great aunt that I had duplicated and used in a very brief article I wrote about Van Sant for Adirondack Life magazine in September 1920, The Kindness of Strangers. Lake George and Osable Chasm were the Adirondacks' first tourist centers, and commercial photographers, often from elsewhere, worked there in the earliest days of the Adirondack photography craze. They frequently came from the big cities that provided the tourists, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Next slide, please. This half stereo view of Lake George is the earliest image of the book and was taken by New York City-based brothers, German-born photographers Louis and Sigismund Beer. It dates to sometime between 1861 and 1863. Osable Chasm was even more popular than Lake George as a tourist site, and about 25 photographers offered photographs of it for sale in the decades before 1920. Next slide, please. The two most prolific photographers of the chasm during the 1870s were regionally based Seneca Ray Stoddard and George W. Baldwin, who had his studio in nearby Keysville for a number of years. This Stoddard image of the chasm is from the Seneca Ray Stoddard collection at the Chapman Museum in Glens Falls. Next slide. This half stereo view is by George W. Baldwin, who, as he lived and worked nearby, took a good number of winter views of the chasm. He was, I believe, the only photographer to do so. The image comes from the Adirondack Experience. I love, by the way, the woodsy logo that Baldwin developed to frame his stereo views, as seen here. Very few photographers offered such highly ornamented identifying information in framing their stereo views. Next slide, please. But here is another view of the chasm, this by William T. Purviance of Philadelphia, who worked in the region in 1873 and 1874. His name is represented in a twiggy rendition that has a good bit in common with that used by Baldwin. I think these rather flamboyant, quote, signatures, unquote, give these images a certain panache. Next slide, please. This stereo view image, taken into Osable Chasm from Devil's Oven, was by New Hampshire photographer Frank Robbins, who created two early Adirondack series between 1865 and 1867. One of them was made up of 38 views of Franklin and Essex County, the other of 33 chasm views. Robbins's photographic foray into the Adirondacks was brief, for by mid-1868, he had moved physically from New Hampshire to Oil City, Pennsylvania, where he became known as the foremost recorder of the Pennsylvania oil boom. I discovered a fascinating bit of information about Robbins, thanks to serendipity, and again to the kindness of an individual. This fact I'm pretty sure I would never have discovered on my own. To elaborate, I was working along in my project one day in the special collections room at SUNY Plattsburgh's Feinberg Library. Somehow or other, I got to chatting with Dr. Gordon Pollard, a retired professor of anthropology at the university, who was also working in the library. I don't remember quite how the connection was made. Maybe the special collections librarian introduced us. But it turned out that Dr. Pollard knew a lot about early photography in the Northern Adirondack region. Pollard told me that when Robbins left New Hampshire, he sold, or otherwise disposed of, his Adirondack photograph negatives to Willis Mould, who owned a drug and stationery store in Keysville. Next slide, please. This is a Mould rendition of a Robbins image of Osable Chasm from the Getty Museum's open content program. It's called Mystic Gorge. Robbins's Adirondack images are much more likely to be seen under Mould's name than Robbins' names. For while Robbins sold his images himself from his base in Keene, New Hampshire, for only a couple of years before he headed off to Pennsylvania, Mould and his son turned them out under the Mould name in Keysville for a good 10 years before Willis Mould's retirement in 1878. Next slide, please. The lists of images, which are a little bit hard to see here, on the verso of the stereo view cards produced by Robbins and the Moulds have different layouts, but use exactly the same numbers and the same wording to identify individual images. And hold that for a moment or two. This use of a photographer's name by a successor was, by the way, typical of how photographers worked. When one retired or relocated, they generally sold their work, as well as their studio if they owned one, to another photographer. And the new owner subsequently reproduced images taken by his predecessor under his own name. This often confuses researchers, sometimes family genealogists, who often come upon an image of a relative for whom they find it difficult to reconcile what looks to be the portrait of a youthful sitter with the latter working dates of the photographer whose name is recorded as seemingly having taken the picture. Excuse me a moment. Next slide, please. There are very few formal studio portraits in the book, although they probably made up the bulk of the photographs taken by the many photographers who worked in the small towns of the Adirondacks during the 1850 to 1950 period. There is, however, this early carte de visite by photographer Lauren Webster of Johnsburg, taken during the years between 1868 and 1870, when backgrounds and props were few. Next slide. At the other end of the scale, it was impossible to resist including this cabinet card by Frank Hawley of Chestertown of a poor, overdressed little girl from the 1890s, when the use of backgrounds and accessories was at its peak. Next slide. Or this one by Alonzo Mix, provided by the Warrensburg Historical Society. The image pays homage to the bicycle frenzy which took over the country in the 1890s. Many other local historical societies besides the one in Warrensburg, as well as public libraries in Adirondack towns, hold photographs, and they were generous in letting me use images from their collections. Next slide, please. This one, of photographer Harold D. Ross's woodland summer studio and shop, was taken somewhere along the Fulton chain of lakes near the turn of the 20th century. It is from the Diane Tyrrell collection at the Inlet Historical Society, and Charlie Hess, president of the society, let me know about it in the summer of 2022, not long after the image was given to the society. This took place quite a while after the completed photographer's book package had gone to Syracuse University Press, but we were able to get the photo into the book anyway, as a frontispiece. Unfortunately, the source references did not make it into the final production. Perhaps there'll be a chance to remedy this in a second printing of the book. That is Ross's little son that you see down at the bottom there. Not only were local historical societies helpful in my search for photographer information, but so were a few in pretty distant parts of the country. Next slide, please. This is not a particularly compelling image, but it is an example of the work of Isaac Labar, a Whitehall, Washington County photographer who took stereo views along the Lake Champlain and Lake George shorelines from the mid-1860s through around 1870. It is from the New York Public Library and is noted by hand on the back as being of the, quote, Battery Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Defiance, Lake Champlain, close quote. In early 1871, Labar left New York State and traveled by train with the Soldiers' Free Homestead Colony to take up land in the brand new town of Gibbon, Nebraska. Barr was only a minor photographer of the Adirondacks, and I couldn't find out much about him, so I got in touch with the Buffalo County Historical Society in Kearney, Nebraska, which covers the Nebraska town in which Labar lived. The following details came from newspapers, clippings, and other records found for me by the archives volunteer in the Buffalo County Historical Society collection, and appear in Labar's one-paragraph biography. They are among my favorite quotes in the entire book. Labar, they related, became a Gibbon merchant, at first from a, quote, boxcar set on a railroad siding, quote, and then from the, quote, first store building in Gibbon, close quote. Finally, he became the owner of the first painted store in Buffalo County. I've never come upon similar lines in Adirondack regional newspapers. There is, by the way, a Labar Street in downtown Gibbon, which now has a population of around 2,000 people. I was impressed with the amount of photographer movement there was during the 100 years I looked at, in terms of both physical relocation and occupational change. There was immigration from Europe and New England to upstate New York, as well as emigration, sometimes by the same people, from upstate New York to the West and to Florida. A surprising number of Adirondack photographers ended up in California, often as farmers. In terms of career change, I came upon a one-time photographer from Horicon, Warren County, Charles McGinley, who became one of the best-known defense lawyers in Michigan. Another, Harvey Hinckley, was born in 1864 on the North Elba, Essex County farm previously owned by abolitionist John Brown, and was briefly a portrait photographer in Westport. But somehow, in the early 1900s, Hinckley became the president of the Adirondack Land and Zinc Company in Joplin, Missouri, a company credited with contributing more than $30,000 in royalties to Joplin's coffers in its first 4 years of existence. Hinckley later landed in Minneapolis, where he had lived before, and he became a dealer in real estate. Next slide, please. Henry J. Kaiser spent between 1902 and 1906 as a photographer in Lake Placid. At the insistence of the father of his fiancée, whom he met in his Lake Placid store, Kaiser left his business in another photographer's hands before heading west to become famous through a number of major infrastructure-related buildings projects, such as highways and dams. He was also involved in a massive shipbuilding undertaking that is considered to have been a decisive factor in the Allies' winning of World War II. This 1906 advertisement was placed in the Plattsburgh Courier-Freeman just after Kaiser's departure from Lake Placid and was provided courtesy of the New York State Library. As you can see, he was rapidly expanding. He had not only his Lake Placid store, but 2 stores in Florida by this time to keep him occupied during the winter. Next slide, please. This is a landscape photograph taken in Wilmington, Essex County by Frederick William Rice, a Saranac Lake guideboat builder and photographer between 1884 and 1904. Rice was best known for a series of 1901 photos he took of Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain, when Clemens and his family summered near his home on Lower Saranac Lake. Next slide, please. This is another of Rice's fine views, this one of a waterside camp. Both photographs are from the Adirondack experience. Rice had a rather unusual history, and being the nephew of a bachelor uncle, William Marsh Rice, who made a fortune in real estate and other ventures in Texas and Louisiana. Rice, the uncle, enters the Adirondack story as the victim of a sensational New York City murder in 1900. The settlement of William Rice's estate provided not only the wherewithal to launch Rice Institute, later Rice University in Houston, Texas, but also provided $75,000 to Fred Rice, one of William Rice's many collateral descendants. It also provided $1,000 each to the first 10 of Rice's 11 children. Rice was able to give up photography and move to Washington State, where he became a Seattle businessman dealing in loans and real estate for his own account. His wife and some of his children returned to New York State, and they later divorced, for the only reason, according to newspaper, that she didn't really much like living in Seattle. This seems a good point at which to end my presentation, although I've barely gotten started on sharing some of the fascinating facts that attach themselves to the disparate individuals responsible for photographing the Adirondacks and its residents during the century between 1850 and 1950. I haven't even touched on some of the bigger names in photographic history with connections to the Adirondacks, such as that of Matthew Brady, who grew up in the region but took no photographs there. There was also the aforementioned William Henry Jackson, who started off as a retoucher or finisher of other photographers' work before becoming one of the most important recorders of the far west, early west. There was also, of course, Alfred Stieglitz, many of whose best-loved images were taken around Lake George, where his family owned a summer home from the mid-1880s. Others, though, have written books about these artists, as they have about regional photographers such as Henry Beach, who took thousands of pictures in otherwise unheralded communities for real photograph postcards in the early 1900s, sometimes in batches of no more than 100 cards. And J.S. Willey, who recorded summer life around Lake George. I know that you will be hearing in 2 months about a new book on Seneca Ray Stoddard, probably the Adirondack's most famous and one of its most prolific photographers. I hope you've been able to catch some of my enthusiasm for a project that honors the tremendous variety of photographers who created the image of the Adirondack past, but still so color our thinking about and reaction to the Adirondacks of today. As you must have noticed, I had a lot of fun writing the book. Thanks for listening. And now, I guess, on to the interview.
On with the interview, indeed. Sally Svenson, first of all, thank you so much for just a remarkable presentation. It's, I have to say, really amazing to see the Adirondacks of up to 150 years ago brought to life through these photographs. And we already have a number of questions, quite a number of questions, in fact, that our audience has submitted through the Q&A feature. And feel free to, if you've been waiting to ask these questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature. I'll try to work all of these into the next few minutes. But I wanted to start with just a big question, and that is, how would you hope people use your book?
I think it's really a reference book, but it's also a great bedside book because some of the stories are really just fun to read. So I would call it both. It is not a book that you sit down and read chapter by chapter, however.
How would you see it fitting in with the other work you've done? Because this is not the first piece of history that you have compiled.
There is not a whole lot that connects what I've written about the Adirondacks, which is actually 4 books at this point. The first book on Adirondack Churches came into my mind as my husband and I were driving south from the Adirondacks to New York, where we live in the winter. And there was a wonderful Baptist church in Minerva. And I just kind of looked at the steeple and I thought, gee, I wonder how on earth they got the design for that, because this is not a really very progressive town. And that started my writing about Adirondack churches, building of them, communities, putting them together. The second book is somewhat of an outlier, and it's called Lily, Duchess of Marlborough, A Portrait with Husbands. Now, it may seem to have nothing to do with the Adirondacks, but in fact, I found Lily's portrait in a history of the Lake Luzerne Episcopal Church, where she bought her mother with the fortune that she was given the use of after the death of her first husband. And she turned out to be a fascinating woman. She was married 3 times. And unfortunately, the book was the only one I self-published, and the self-publisher kind of took off after a couple of years, leaving no royalties for anybody or any information about the book. But I was interested to see this morning when I looked up the book online, that Amazon is offering a new copy, according to them, for $1,100 if anybody is interested in it. It also shows up on eBay with some regularity, more in the $50 to $70 range. The next book I wrote, Blacks in the Adirondacks, has it was interesting because I watched Amy Godine's program on her book on Blacks in the Adirondacks, and it was discussed that we had different ways of approaching it. And yes, mine was very different. I was working after the completion of Lily on a book about maybe boathouses, but with which I got bored. But during this time, before it was available online, I would spend a lot of time at the New York Public Library going through microfilm copies of the Lake George newspaper. And I kept coming upon articles about Black waiters working in Lake George. The head waiter of Hotel Champlain had started the Cuban Giants, the Black baseball team. So there was a lot about Black baseball players in there. There were groups that were coming up from the South to raise money for their schools. And I just kind of kept putting those things away. And eventually I decided that this was a subject worth writing about. And that kind of took me to photographers, and you saw how I got involved with that. So that's the background.
It sounds like there's a lot of serendipity involved for you.
There is a lot of serendipity, and everything is challenging and interesting.
And it, don't sell yourself short. There are obviously connections. In fact, as you were talking about the New York Cuban Giants, I guess it reminded me that there's a photograph in this latest book of the Fort William Henry Hotel baseball team, which is a Black baseball team.
Absolutely, there were several baseball teams, and they all came from that region because that was the region that had Black waiters. But yeah, there were a lot of Black TB patients, et cetera, and I was just interested in all of them. It was not, unlike Amy, she was able to pin down one issue. I'm not good at that. So.
There are several concepts that you talked about in your presentation and that figure in your book that I thought we should talk a little about. For people who aren't necessarily familiar with early photography, what was the significance of stereo views and stereo viewers?
Well, it was a way of recording scenery before there were a lot of wide angle cameras. And not sure what else to say about it, but it was a popular format. It was a special camera that took two pictures a little bit far apart from one another, which would come together in stereoscopes, I guess they were called, which brought them together. And it was just a format that a lot of people found easy to work with. And it was popular well into the 1870s. And then it was taken over by individual images.
Do I recall that people had to look through kind of a special device that...
It was called a stereoscope, and it kind of put the two images and it gave a somewhat three-dimensional figure in the middle if you looked at it correctly.
Well, and that brings up a question that Anthony asks from our audience, and he writes, from early days of photography in the Adirondacks and then throughout the years, how were these photographs presented to the public, and through what media format? Magazines, newspapers, exhibits, galleries, etc. How did people, I guess, consume photography in the 19th century?
Well, before they were able to reproduce photographs, there were a lot of engravings done of them. So you would take a photograph and then an artist would interpret it somewhat originally, usually, and that was how they appeared. But they were advertised by the photographers themselves. They appeared in drugstores. They appeared here and there, and it was really the only available way. And if you were a nice middle-class person, you had a stereoscope on your table and you needed to have a supply of things to show through it. And that was why people bought stereo views.
You also, when you were talking about your research, one of the archives you mentioned was Fulton History, the collection of postcards. What can you tell us about that? It sounds like a really kind of rich resource for you.
Well, the Fulton History site, I don't know if most people know it who do a lot of research in the Adirondacks. It doesn't do the little papers of the central Adirondacks, but it does a lot around the edges. And it covers things like the Albany papers, which often wrote about the Adirondacks. And so it is a wonderful source for communities that are not otherwise represented in your historic newspapers.
This is it's an interesting thought to consider. I mean, we learn about some of these earliest photographers who went on to do other things. What was it that made people become photographers in the 19th century? This was a brand new field.
I think it was exciting if you were into technology in any way. And there was always the thought that maybe you would make money at it. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of tinkerers. Tinkerers is the word that somebody used to describe these early photographers. And some of them had the knack and some of them didn't. And some of them had an artistic eye and some of them didn't. And some of them found certainly that it did not meet their financial needs and moved on. They became truckers. They became any number of things that were very different from where they started off. And that's part of what makes it fun. So
these are people that would have lined up for the 19th century equivalent of the latest iPhone, it sounds like.
Yeah, and they might have had a social media account too, and they might have even started. They might have been bloggers, who knows?
There are several questions about photographers whom you didn't necessarily mention in the presentation, but people are curious about. Kathy asks, did you find any information or much information about Richard K. Dean?
Nothing. Oh, no, Dean is in there. So, yeah, no, he's definitely in there. He made it in there just because he's opened, I think, his business in 1948 or some such thing. And he was a prolific postcard photographer, and he is included. He makes the date cut.
And Frank writes, did you have any comments about Hobart Roberts?
Yes, I have quite a few comments about Hobart Roberts. He was a man who was famous for wildlife photography, particularly wildlife photography at night, and essentially a hobbyist, but he was represented in exhibits here and exhibits in London, and his work frequently appeared in magazines and newspapers. So yes, he is well covered in the book.
And I will say there is an amazing photograph in your book of a deer staring right at him. I guess it must be in a brook or a stream, and the deer is reflected. It's a marvelous picture.
Yeah, no, it's. I explained in the book how he took the pictures. He would have two flashes, someone else in the boat, they would flash the light, which would catch the attention of the animal, and then they would quickly take a picture with the other camera. But he was a specialist in night photography, although he also did other photography as well. But not to make money. I mean, he was well-to-do. His father owned a department store, and he worked there, but he got tremendous pleasure out of what he did.
Such a complex process it must have been for taking photographs like that in the 19th century.
Yeah, and apparently kind of buggy.
I'm sure.
Maybe 2 captures in an evening and in a night's long sitting out there waiting for an animal to appear would be considered a good night haul. So.
You told us, of course, about Florence Van Sant, one of only 11 women photographers your research yielded information about. Why were there so many women in the field, or so few women in the field, do you think?
Well, probably the technical quality again of the early research, and when there's a line in my book somewhere about what women would be good at, perhaps taking children's photographs or landscape photographs, but they were not really considered to have the capacity to be out there in the wilds taking photographs. But there was a lot of very heavy equipment involved. You couldn't just take your little Leica out and shoot pictures in the early days.
I gather they were encouraged to be the receptionist for photo studios operated by men, however.
Absolutely, yes. I can certainly understand that.
There's a question from Robin who would like to know if you know of a photographer who primarily photographed the interiors of great camps.
There were several who did. I mean, names don't really jump to mind, but there are a number of them. If you look at the Adirondacks experience and look up something on their photographic site like interiors, you will find a number of interiors that were photographed by professionals.
And of course, we would encourage people to buy this book and look through it for biographies of what these photographers specialized in.
Of course, so they can find it in libraries, hopefully at some point.
Absolutely. I have a question that kind of dovetails with a question that Barbara Franklin asks. I have looked through this book many times, and there is one photograph that always stands out as just a little bit different. It is a group of girl summer campers at Camp Red Wing from the late 1940s, which is, I guess, just before the cutoff for your book. And maybe it's because the image is so relatively recent compared to the others, but it is really the only image in which the subjects are smiling. And I guess I wonder, when you were putting this book together, how much thought did you give to the people who were often pictured in these images? It's sort of one thing to think about the photographers, but it's another thing to think of the people who had to pose for these photographers.
Well, and I'm sure that they were flattered to be asked for the most part, unless it was a very off-the-cuff photograph. If you have ever been to summer camp, which I did for many years, the photograph that I included in there of the girls in camp looked exactly like year after year photos from summer camps. And it was how the camps advertised themselves by these kind of memory books. And I can see that it would make an entirely good career if you could spend your life taking those pictures.
Well, and it struck me that the hairstyles may have changed, but you could probably look at a picture from a summer camp that was taken last summer, and it would look pretty much like that picture.
There might be less fabric in the shorts, but that's about it.
We had a question from Carol, who is wondering if you might know who would have been the photographer at Sagamore in the early 1900s through the 1920s.
There's a name that's not coming to my mind. It's mentioned in the book that he photographed a lot at Sagamore, and there's actually a collection of Sagamore photographs at the New York Historical Society taken by him, maybe 7 or 8 photographs. So
I was just consulting the index and it wasn't helping me, but at the risk of playing Stump the Author, we encourage people to read through it.
Yeah, no, because some of the photographs at the New York History Society are quite good, and if you look up there, they have probably a good reference to them. I'm not sure if they have the photographs themselves.
We had a question and a comment from Lorraine Duval, who I believe we'll be talking to in a subsequent part of this series. But she says the 7.5 mile water slide you showed was of Stiles Brook, which empties into the east branch of the Ausable River in Keene. She includes a few of Van Sant's photos, Florence Van Sant's photos in her book, Where the Stiles Brook Waters Flow, enhanced with some relevant stories. And she's wondering if you might talk a little about the Van Sant article you mentioned that was published in Adirondack Life a few years back.
Well, it was very short. It was just, I was so excited about having found a woman, and I was so excited about having gotten a hold of this picture of her that I wanted the world to know about it. And there isn't much more to say, except that nobody really knows who she is. As I said, the archives pictures are not labeled as hers, and they're very interesting. The fact that she was selling photographs to the Museum of Natural History in New York shows that she had a very successful but very brief career. Her husband died in maybe 1908. She moved to Westchester. Then she moved back up to the Adirondacks, married a substantially younger man, and became a housewife. So that was what one did.
You, of course, mention Matthew Brady in this book, who grew up in the region but was not a photographer here. Do we know for sure that he never took any Adirondack photographs, or do you hold out hope that someday someone might find that photo he took of Lake George?
It's possible, but there are a lot of people who think that he wasn't even born in the United States, but he was born in Ireland, but was afraid to say anything about it because the Irish were not really respected in those days. So what we hear about his career here is pretty much hearsay.
And so it's entirely possible that the childhood in Lake George and Saratoga might be either invented or embellished.
Embellished, or maybe shorter than it was. It was actually Warrensburg that he grew up in, theoretically. So well, it's too bad he didn't take pictures here, but he was gone by the time the photography was really a very well-developed art.
Jerry McGovern is wondering, did you find much intersection of your exploration of photographers and blacks in the Adirondacks? You mentioned the baseball teams, but other than that?
Other than that, I'm afraid not. No, just it was none at all. I mean, there were some interesting findings that, in fact, the fact that the waiters in Lake George, their favorite club that for those who worked in hotels there was the Minstrel Club, which you think of being just so totally anti-black, but they just thought it was fun. So there was a bit about them, but nothing, I'm afraid, relating to photography. I tried.
Susan Smith is wondering, did you find any photographers who focused on the greater Cranberry Lake region?
Yes, there were a couple who did, one of whom was a tuberculosis patient by the name of Plant Way in Saranac Lake, he came from Potsdam, in fact, and he ended up living in Cranberry Lake after he left Saranac Lake for several years before moving on to, I've forgotten where. But so there's another one who worked there for several years and who was, again, I don't remember the name. I've got other names in my head these days besides the photographers. But yeah, there were a couple who specialized in it, in that region. And if you look at any books about them, you will find their work there.
Sally Sheldon harkens back to early in your presentation, is wondering which end of Lake George is in the first picture you showed.
At the southern end, the village of Lake George, which was Caldwell in those days. But that was really the kind of center of tourist activity at the beginning. So and
it's amazing how modern that photograph looks. You could almost imagine if you walk through that gate, there being motels just past it.
Yeah, and there's water and trees.
Yeah.
Still there.
Anthony, who has a number of really good questions, also was wondering how much copywriting was done in the early years of photography, and at what point in time did it become common practice? I know you talk about how photographers essentially would get an entire archive from a previous photographer and kind of slap their own name on it, and that was common practice.
Yeah, that was not going against. That was part of the purchase deal, and you were buying a studio and you were buying the work, because if you were moving from here to California to become a farmer, you probably did not need to take the negatives that you had taken in Warrensburg, New York, with you. So it was not an issue. That was just the way business worked. But I've actually had a lot of people say over the years, I wonder what ever happened to so-and-so's photographs. And it's likely they were just passed down to the next photographer. And
Right.
I was right. I wrote an article once, or I wrote in my book about a Black woman who was a domestic in somewhere near Warrensburg. And I couldn't figure out why she looked so young in the pictures, given the name of the photographer. Once I started reading about photographers, I figured it out. It was just passed along, and it was a new name on an old photograph.
Wow. Do you have I don't know, a favorite photograph you found in doing the research for this book, or at least one that most intrigues you?
No, I found so many. Once you saw, I mean, my little girl standing there with her eyeglasses and her over puffy sleeved dress. I mean, I love that one, but I also, as you can see, love the Van Sant ones. They're different. There's some wonderful landscapes in there that it's hard to imagine. And it's just, that was the excitement of it, was just finding how many I did love.
Barbara Franklin asks, did anyone photograph Native Americans in those days? And also is wondering why so few animals are portrayed.
Well, the Roberts did animals, but it's hard to keep animals still, and we hadn't really developed much in the early days in terms of stop photography, et cetera. So you would probably catch a shadow flitting through, and that would be about it. But yeah, I mean, that's really all I can answer. But no, there were not many.
Sounds like every picture I have attempted to take of otters over the years.
Exactly. But you've got a very high-end camera, I'm sure. So Roberts tried all of those animals. He took pictures of beavers, and he took pictures. He had tripwires that animals would take their own picture if they walked in front of the tree in which the camera was located, et cetera. So he was very modern in that respect.
Well, and speaking of modern, there was the photographer, the gentleman who used a pseudonym, who actually took a self-portrait, which has to be one of the earliest Adirondack selfies.
And one of the more bizarre ones, you know, when you focus on your body with about three sides of a body of a deer, you're doing well. But yeah, there are a lot of dead deer pictures, and that they were really easy to photograph. But moving ones were probably harder.
Yeah. Faith would like to know, was there a particular noted photographer or several in Paul Smith's between 1870 and 1930 who should be explored? And aside from the Adirondack Experience database and the couple of newspaper databases you mentioned, where else should one look if one is especially motivated to learn more about photographers in this region?
Well, as I said, the New York Public Library has a lot of early ones. Because they were all kind of getting early collections when we were thinking about copyright, and we weren't really thinking very, very far back, or I mean, very far ahead. The Getty Museum has a lot of stereo views from some of those out-of-region photographers who came to look to Lake George, particularly.
And photographers in Paul Smith's in particular, do you know of any?
There was a guy by the name, I think it's Derby, who was in some cases called his office Paul. This is the most famous one. I think there's a photograph here and there, one of Paul Smith's relatives.
Yes, Charles Derby.
Yeah, he ended up with a stationery store, I think, and he didn't last forever, as most of them did not. But
and I'm reminded we did not necessarily answer the question of whether Native Americans were ever featured in photographs from this era.
Not really. A bit later, but there wasn't. I could be totally wrong in this. There was not that much interaction on the kind of grounds in which you would find Native Americans at that time. Certainly by the mid 20th century, yes, but not too early.
David Allen would like to know, are there collections of wintertime photos or particular photographers who specialized in them?
Well, as I pointed out, George Baldwin took a lot of Sable Chasm winter photographs. No, there weren't, probably because most of the pictures they were taken were of summer tourists, because that was who might want to buy their photographs. And probably Henry Beach did, but I don't think of it. They were probably also just hard to take in general because the lighting is difficult, et cetera, for early cameras.
And the amount of time you would have to spend outside capturing them in the bitter cold.
Exactly, yes, and that's something to count on too. But no, mostly Baldwin, because he took a great many of those Osable Castle winter photographs, and nobody else did. So.
Anthony also wonders, and we talked a little about this, what you think many of these early photographers might have to say about today's use of digital cameras and accompanying photo software. And it sounds like these would have been kind of early adopters of this kind of technology.
It would be just like today, when a lot of people would scoff at the whole idea and others would think it's just great. So I don't think you can really generalize an answer on that.
My dog is contributing to the conversation. I apologize, but we have one more that I think might wrap this up nicely, and that's from Anne, who says, "Given your serendipity, she's curious as to what next topic has caught your attention now that this wonderful book has been published."
Oh, well, I'm afraid there is another one which has absolutely nothing to do with any of the others, and that is amusement parks, theme parks, and attractions of the Adirondacks. And the Adirondacks turned out to be a leader in the development of theme parks. And for those who know much about Adirondack history, Arto Monaco had a lot to do with that. Because while Walt Disney is considered the founder of the theme park, Arto Monaco was out in Hollywood at the same time, working on back lots and working on animation, which is what drove a lot of the theme parks. So yeah, I've written about that for Adirondack Life, also about a place called the Serpentarium, where they were looking at snakes. I wrote that in conjunction with the the Adirondacks famous snake person, who again is escaping my mind at the moment. But yeah, and there were other things. I mean, the first one of Sacandaga Park was an early trolley park, although there wasn't a trolley leading to it. So yeah, it's another one of those serendipitous subjects. It's just endlessly fascinating.
And I imagine there's a connection. I imagine there are photographs of these places.
Well, yeah. Later rather than earlier. I mean, they're the one from Sarah yeah, the ones from were not terribly interesting, just mostly tintypes. I think there are a couple of tintypes in my book, actually, both of which were taken at Sacandaga Park, which is where photography came into that field early on.
I point out that if people missed it in the chat, Annabelle from the museum just points out that they've just acquired a souvenir pennant from the Serpentarium.
Yes, I suggested they might want that. That was my idea. So just because I know they have nothing about that particular attraction, and it looked to be in beautiful shape, and they bought it. So.
A little behind the scenes info there. We have one last question that I want to squeeze in because Michael Bettman asked this question, and maybe you can shed some light on it. Do you have any idea when we started seeing photographs in newspapers? I mean, certainly based on the research you did into all these newspaper archives.
I mentioned that in 1880. They first ran a real newspaper photograph in 1880.
Wow.
And, I've forgotten. I think it was 1920s or 1930s that it became much more common. But before that, as I say, it was always engraving.
Well, Sally Svenson, it's a wonderful story, and we're just so delighted that you could share all of this knowledge that you gained from doing the research. And I'll hold up the book. I hope there it is. I hope
as my husband says, it's much cheaper than psychiatry. It's extremely entertaining, and I do it pretty well in it too.
And people should snap it up now before it's sold on Amazon for $1,100.
And you might want the one about Lily Duchess of Marlborough for $1,100. Great book. Mitch, thanks for the interview. It's fun.
Thank you so much, and I think we'll turn things back over now to Jenny Ambrose.
Thank you very much. What a great program. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for In the Adirondack Library. We invite you back next month on February 12th, when we will feature the next book in the series, African Americans of St. Lawrence County, North Country Pioneers. Local historian Brian Thompson will discuss his research into Black communities of St. Lawrence County and their contributions to the history and culture of the region. To register for the program, follow the link in chat or visit the ADKX website. A reminder that the full schedule for our monthly programs, including new books and authors added to the series, is available on our website. See you next month.